Hello and welcome back to Red in the Face. We're now on to episode 5. Just want to give a quick shout out to everyone who checked out the last few episodes. If you didn't, then you can catch us on Spotify, Podbean, Bandcamp, YouTube, all the links. Find us on Facebook and Twitter for those. Today, episode 5, we're going to be talking about the sort of a comparison between the coronavirus response from capitalist and socialist states. So we talked a bit about, in episode 3, we talked about the UK's reaction, a little bit about America. So I want to do a quick recap on what some of the things that we talked about, some of the criticisms that we had of those responses to coronavirus before we get onto some of the socialist responses.
Yeah, I think the main thing we sort of came out of that episode is that it was less about, a lot of the time, sort of looking at Britain's response, the distinction was less about how does a socialist country respond to coronavirus and how does a capitalist country respond to it. It was more of a case of Britain has decided that the state is going to play very little role in trying to combat this virus, whereas other states like Germany and New Zealand, who are capitalist countries, have decided that the state is going to play a significant role in combating this virus and therefore have got a lot less deaths than us. But the distinction again is there's a distinction to be made that we made between capitalist countries, and then there's a distinction again to be made between countries such as, I mean, definition, it's hard to define them as a maybe socialist country, but countries that have high amounts of state planning, like Venezuela and like Cuba and like Vietnam, who have combated this virus extremely well, even compared to the likes of New Zealand and Germany.
This is lower, this is upper. This is the oppressed, this is the oppressed. This is the exploited, this is the exploiter.
Hierarchy as it exists in the family. Hierarchy as it exists in the school.
Is it right that so many people live in such poverty in a society surrounded by such riches? No, it obviously is not.
Because of the way this society is organized, because of the violence that exists on the surface everywhere, you have to expect that there are going to be such explosions. You have to expect things like that as reactions.
Since we recorded our last coronavirus episode a couple of weeks ago, there's been some changes. There's been an easing of lockdown to some extent, or at least a plan for when it's going to be eased. I mean, today they've announced you're going to be allowed to meet up to 6 people outside your household in your garden or park or whatever. What else has happened since? Oh yeah, the Dominic Cummings story happened since last time. Where I don't even actually fully understand it. He went up to Durham, didn't he? Because he wanted to test his eyesight or some shit. Something like that. Yeah, so basically lockdowns being eased. So some of the things that we were talking about, how the Conservative Party doesn't want the state to play much of a role in controlling the virus, are coming true. So bring on the second wave, basically. So do we want to talk about, want to make the comparison now then? Talk about how places like, should we start with China? How China has responded to coronavirus, because obviously it originated in China, and that has led to some very bad takes from people on all sides of the political spectrum. So, Harley, do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to kick off really is probably combating some of the narrative around China, because I'm sure that people who have any level of awareness, who have read the news reports about China, are aware that racism has certainly tinged it somewhat. If you remember in the early days of the virus, everyone was saying that it came because all these damn Chinese people were out eating bats in these dodgy markets, but that's been proven to not be the case. I think they've traced a case back to November the 15th, I think, in France, and China's first case when they traced it all back as November 16th. So it's in question whether it even originated in China, but whether it did or didn't isn't particularly the point. Regardless of where the virus originated, it doesn't really legitimize the racist narrative around China. And a lot of the Western press has sort of marched in step with each other in denouncing China and saying that, oh, this is all China's fault, China, 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 and it's typical deflection tactics to sort of mask the fact that Western countries have, on the whole, had a pretty piss-poor response, whereas in China, where they've got a significantly state-planned economy, they've actually had one of the most comprehensive responses out of any country. And then there's other countries like Vietnam where they've had 0 deaths at all because, again, they've got a state-planned economy. They're able to mobilize the entire economy in the interest of public health.
I think what we need to know about this is that they added coronavirus victims to the victims of communism death list. But yeah, the fact that they want to put China under sanctions for coronavirus, they want to sanction China for coronavirus when America is leading every conceivable chart and list for coronavirus deaths and damage done by coronavirus, tells you all you need to know. The fact that President Trump is comparing his coronavirus briefings to the ratings that Monday Night Football gets.
I hadn't heard that he was doing that, but fuck me. And I absolutely love his line of the reason that we've got the most cases is because we do the best testing. So it's like his whole thing is like, because we've done the most testing in the world, that's the reason we've got the best cases, like the most cases. It's all just one big competition to him. But yeah, like you say with that, like Harley said with China, is that wherever it originated from in any way, I mean, what has been shown is that the West decided not to prepare themselves for it, despite knowing this was coming down the road. They have turned to just blaming China for this instead of reacting in their own way. I mean, the World Health Organization, Trump has tried, because the World Health Organization have been very praiseworthy of China for their openness with regard to like exchanging information about the virus, letting scientists into Wuhan, basically being as open and as transparent as they can be. Donald Trump has basically pulled the US funding from the World Health Organization, made this international institution that has done a lot of good in the world seem like it's somehow run from China, despite, I'm pretty sure, on its headquarters, isn't it a UN organization, which is a organization dominated by the US, whose headquarters are in the US, etc., etc. So yeah, it's straight away been a tactic of capitalist countries, divide and rule, point the blame somewhere else and make people fight amongst themselves instead of blaming the people that are to blame for 100,000 cases in America, 40,000 plus in the UK. Blame China instead is a lot easier.
So just before we get into some of the specifics about how China has dealt with coronavirus, I think it's important to point out, like, I don't think it matters what you think about how how China is governed or the structure of government in China, and we probably have some differing views in it. It's something that I'm sort of looking up and researching at the minute. But at the very least, they don't let their population die of a terrible disease for the sake of saving the market and saving a capitalist class. At least you can say that from. So do we want to now get on to talking about some of the details?
I was just going to say that the difficulty is, like you're saying there, about trying to research it. It's obviously difficult through the prism of Western media and things like that to try and gauge the response. But at the end of the day, China is a population of what, like 2 billion people? Is it 2 billion? Close to
1.4.
Overall, 1.4. Still quite a bit off. 1.4 billion, basically a fuckload of people. Either way, who are fully connected to a lot of times in contact with Western media, so use certain social media sites the same. I mean, we've all gone to university with Chinese students, for example. There's a lot of communication there. This idea that if the response had been as awful as the Western media try and make out about China, then we would have found out about it, but that's not the case. What's happened is that China reacted very, very quickly. They made treatments free. Obviously didn't happen in the US. New temporary hospitals, electricity, wireless and heating services. They pledged not to cut those off. State industries redirected production towards essential goods and medical supplies. So just straight away there was that shift. And then when their cases are really low, literally every article is, we can't trust China. E.g., Venezuela's cases are really low. And if you search Venezuela coronavirus, just also every institution, the BBC, everyone's saying why you can't trust Venezuela and their coronavirus count. It's like, have you connected the dots and seen why Vietnam, Venezuela, China, all these places, even New Zealand with like a centre-left government, haven't got very high corona. Like there's a link there. It's not just because you can't trust them, it's because there's a reason that they responded in the way they did to this crisis.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the you can't trust China's cases phenomenon, because actually China has a higher death rate from the virus than New Zealand does, but we're not hearing anything in the media about how we can't trust New Zealand and how New Zealand are clearly lying about their numbers. I think Trump said that hundreds of thousands of Chinese people must have died from it. There's no evidence for it whatsoever, and the World Health Organization doesn't seem to think so either. So the idea that you can't trust them, again, like you pointed out with Venezuela, it's nothing to do with these countries being illegitimate or these countries having a dodgy track record. It's because they're countries that oppose Western hegemony, and it's quite embarrassing for Western countries to admit that they've been outdone in this regard by countries that they don't necessarily politically agree with.
Just a funny little anecdote about Venezuela, when we talk about Venezuela and the way that they've dealt with coronavirus. Did anyone see it's been brought back on Twitter a lot in the last couple of days. Did you see the tweet that Dan Hodges put out, I think in sort of mid-March when things were starting, about...
that's his third mention now, seriously. He's going to be suing us up the arse.
He's... I really don't like the guy. I think he's one of the worst. And he's actually... One thing he's very good at is getting things consistently wrong. So he at least has that value.
I was going to say, please... Anyone search, you want to know Dan Hodges, search Alex Nunn's Dan Hodges Twitter thread. It is unbelievable.
I think I might have seen that as well. Yeah, he's just an interesting character, let's put it that way. But he tweeted near the beginning of the crisis, I think he's very defensive over the UK's response. He's always talking about how, we're not doing the worst, don't say that we're doing the worst, it's damaging, say that. And then now as of today, and some of the numbers with the death rates have come in from different countries, it does actually show that we're doing the worst in the world. I think, pretty sure I saw that earlier on today. But anyway, so he's very defensive of the government's response to coronavirus. And so I think he was replying to someone who was criticising the UK's response near the beginning of the crisis, saying, well, wait till you see what happens in Venezuela. Wait till coronavirus hits Venezuela. The current death rate from coronavirus in Venezuela is 10. It's 10. 10 people have died. There's been more cases than that, but there's been 10 deaths from coronavirus in Venezuela. So, up yours, Dan, you prick. Not this Dan Hodges.
I was going to say, can we say Hodges there? Just not we're going to fall out. But yeah, I was going to say, talking about that idea of Western media narratives and things, and it's inbuilt to the media to look on China and Venezuela negatively. Like literally, I just employed to search Venezuela coronavirus response and listen to what Morgan has just said, that 10 people have died, and then see the first 10 Google searches, because they are all awful. It's like it's either wait till it hits, Venezuela getting ready for coronavirus, and it's like a illegitimate crackdown on liberties, etc., etc. But that gets nowhere near as much highlighting these socialist countries about doomsday scenarios, when in reality what they have been doing, countries like Cuba and China, they've been 300 Chinese doctors began arriving in Italy on early March to help with the local effort against coronavirus. 52 health professionals from Cuba. That's better than any other Western or European or the EU countries could do. None of these countries that are meant to be friends, we're meant to be part of this post-war settlement where we're all friends in Europe. No other country was sending doctors to other countries. It took the likes of Cuba and China to step up to the plate. And I think it speaks to something wider, that what we're seeing a lot of third world countries who are starting, and some not regarded as third world countries, starting to realign their interests away from the likes of America and Britain and the Western world towards the likes of China, maybe Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, because America just has let them down for a number of years. The World Bank and the IMF aren't helping these countries, but the Belt and Road Initiative in China is actually helping them. So we're seeing as part of the coronavirus response as well, is that a lot of countries are looking now to China and Cuba and these socialist countries, or like whatever you want to call China, but they're looking for help from them and not from the US, because the US are just unwilling to help. So I think it speaks to a wider sort of shift in international power towards more third world countries or global south countries see China as their saving grace, or the likes of China as their saving grace, rather than the US.
Yeah, I just want to jump on the point about realignment of politics. There's a video somewhere, a Serbian politician, possibly the Serbian prime minister, and he's basically just absolutely slating the EU and Europe, and he's basically saying, you guys didn't do shit. But we extend our greatest gratitude and thanks to China, because China was the country sending massive amounts of aid to Serbia, whilst Serbia's European neighbours were just like, just let them fucking die. We don't really care. And there was a big billboard that said, "Thank you, Mr. Xi." And I quite liked that. I got very happy seeing that billboard. I thought it was quite cute.
But even like that though, even with the UK, that there was that transatlantic cruise ship, which was carrying 682 passengers from the UK, found itself stranded. They knew there was people that test positive for coronavirus on board, and basically the UK had to contact Cuba or America to try and help the ship out. The US told them to fuck off, and Cuba took the boat in and treated all its patients and then sent it back on its way. So it's like they have done nothing. These countries have done, like likes of Cuba, have done nothing but expel international solidarity, and all they get is slagged off for it. I'm not saying that because as a result of that Britain will now realign its interest towards Cuba. It's obviously not going to happen. But a lot of third world countries where having a partnership with America is literally offering them nothing. Acts of international solidarity like this by countries like Cuba and China, hopefully, again, it's just a hope, it's that interests are going to shift away from America. And as Red in the Face have said a million times, death to America.
Death to America, of course.
Of course.
Does anyone know? I was wondering. Does anyone know the current sort of lockdown situation in China? The measures. Is it very much like regional? Obviously, China's a big country.
There was. Sorry, it's not really an answer to your question, but there was a city where I think maybe 10 people tested positive for it again at some point, and they went entirely into lockdown again until there's 10 people sorted, and then once that was all sorted,
in China.
Once that was all cleared out, in China, once that was all cleared out, business as usual, which is the effective response.
I think that was Wuhan. I think 6 people tested positive, so they tested 10 million people over the course of a week and a half-ish. But as far as I understand, the lockdown in China, it's very much on a regional basis at the minute. So places in the south of China are probably not particularly concerned with the virus, whereas I imagine there's a lot more concern in places immediately surrounding Wuhan. But as I understand it, China is easing their lockdown a lot more rapidly than we are here in the UK. And that's because they've been able to effectively contain the virus so much more with such a better efficiency than we have here in the UK. I mean, we've not contained the virus. We still have hundreds of people dying every day from it. Whereas in China, I think there was a week, maybe last week, where they didn't report any new cases. And the number of new cases in China as a whole is incredibly minimal. Vietnam has had no deaths out of, admittedly, only 500-ish cases. But I think the significant lack of cases, considering its geographical proximity to China, is really something that stands out from the rest of the world. Vietnam's had no deaths and under 500 cases, whereas the UK has had 35,000-ish deaths and far, far more cases. I think it says a great deal about the Vietnamese response in comparison to the British response.
I think it's a simple barometer is that the announcement today, as we're recording, is that English Premier League football is going to come back in the next couple of weeks. That's on a similar time, and that's going to be played in empty stadiums. Maybe even in the big games, going to be played in neutral stadiums due to fears of like gatherings happening. That's happening around the same time that China is talking about bringing back the Chinese Super League with full access to the stadium for fans. So as just a guide to how far away we are, we're happy to start competitive sport again. Obviously, without fans. And I know obviously it happened in China sooner, but the fact that they're that far along, that they are happy to allow like mass gatherings, just shows how quickly they've got on top of this and how much. It does worry me, restrictions to lockdown. It worries me a lot, but I don't know what the government's motivations are. If the government's motivations are second wave is inevitable, so we've got to almost encourage it in the UK, then that's, their announcements sort of go in line with that. But I really just don't know what to think anymore.
Well, on your point about the Premier League, a big part of the reason that they're actually starting the Premier League up again is the companies like Sky and BT that own the rights to these games have lobbied because they're not getting, they haven't got their money's worth this season. They paid for these rights and they haven't got the games. So part of the deal that was published today said that the showing of these games would be on these channels again. So a huge part of bringing sport back was the lobbying. I think the BBC now have access as well, purely because of people's discontent. But it's greed. The hand of the market is flipping everyone off.
And who owns Chinese football clubs are owned by the Chinese state as well. So therefore, there is no that conflict of interest because they understand that football will come back when it's safe to come back, and there's no outside pressure to finish the league due to TV rights. It's crazy. Like, going a bit sidetracked, but just as we're on the point, it's very tough for me to say this because I'm a Liverpool fan and fuck me, I want us to win the league. But there are footballers still testing positive for coronavirus in the Premier League. They've done wide testing and they're still going to go out and play. Just again, as a barometer of where we're at as a society, we have people that are testing positive in a workplace in which you have to physically be in the same space and touch other people. And they're going to make them go out and work because it's £100 million business. It's just all about where the priorities are, and the priorities in socialist-led countries or state-planned countries has been, let's use the arms of the state to, like Harley said earlier, to deal with a health crisis towards public health. That's what the arms of the state are going to do. Whereas we've sort of just said, well, we'll just cave in to any pressure, any capital pressure that comes towards us. We'll just cave into your demands. And even within Britain, it's different. I mean, shops are going to be opening in England before they're going to be opening in Scotland. It's just bullshit.
Yeah, so I thought it'd be good to nail down some of the specifics of how China's actually dealt with the virus. We'll link a comment in the description, references, whatever you want to call it. But we'll link an article, in the references that's really in-depth. It's done by 3 researchers. At least one of them is a professor, I think. It's very, very in-depth, and I've got a lot of useful information from it, plenty of great sources, etc., etc. So it's not some fringe, obscure bullshit. But a key part of China's response has actually been on the local community level. So we've spoken a fair bit about the response of the Chinese state and how things have been done at a high government level. But at the community level, China have urban civil organizations, and I can't pronounce the name because I don't speak Mandarin, but it's basically a neighborhood committee, and it's comprised of volunteers. So when people were in lockdown, when people were thinking, okay, I'm stuck in my house, how am I going to get food? These neighborhood committees, they went out and they gave people food. They went and did people shopping, particularly for people who were vulnerable. And they delivered medical supplies, food, basic medical aid, that sort of thing. And it's been a massive part of the Chinese response. And it is something that we have on some level seen in the UK with volunteers and charity organizations, but it's not integrated into local government in any sort of way. So there's no coordinated response like there was in China with these neighborhood committees. And it's been a major reason that China's had such an effective response, is because they've got this infrastructure in place. They have these local organizations that are mass movements of people that are able to mobilize people on a massive scale for the public good. And we just don't have that in the UK.
I thought it'd be interesting to talk a bit about misinformation, because you were just telling us some of the programs that China has organized to help people with coronavirus. And I think it's crazy, like what we were talking about, when you Google search Venezuela, for example, all the stories are negative, even though about coronavirus. I mean, all the stories are negative, even though they have only had 10 deaths from coronavirus. We want to talk a bit about how Western media portrays. I know we've touched on it, but portrays China, because I have criticisms of the way China is governed, but they're conceptual, and the they're conceptual differences, because I think in terms of news and what you hear about things that are happening, like sort of these horrifying things that are happening in China, I'm much more skeptical of that. So yeah, do we want to talk a bit about that? We know it's happening with coronavirus, so do you want to talk about how it happens more generally, maybe, or?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we'll have to probably save the bulk of this for our inevitable episode on Western media and its distortions, or the big spicy China episode where half the listeners decide that they hate me suddenly. But in general, I think it helps to look at it in terms of who is the global hegemon right now. It's undoubtedly the US, with the UK sort of on a leash like a little pit bull. And who is threatening that hegemony. So you have countries like Russia, like China, and Russia is by no means socialist. Just to address that comment we got on our latest video about Putin being a communist billionaire.
Yeah, do better, guys. Do better.
Yeah, please come up with better hate comments. Russia's in no way socialist, but they do oppose Western interests. If you look at Syria, for example, Russia has been a major supporter of Assad. And it's not exactly a secret that Western countries were pretty unilaterally against Assad. So it's less necessarily about socialism and the way their economies are run, and more about the way in which countries threaten Western interests. I mean, Iran is an Islamic theocracy. It's not a socialist country, but it prevents the US from accessing Iranian oil. It prevents building a pipeline between Iraq and Pakistan, for example. It's an obstacle for Western interests and an obstacle for Western businesses, which is why they're so heavily in the media spotlight and why they're so heavily criticized. But if you look at a country like Brazil, which is run by Bolsonaro, which is, he's essentially a fascist, the US media is suspiciously quiet on him. Maybe they'll call him an authoritarian, maybe they'll say some nasty stuff about him, but US media isn't calling for the violent overthrow of the Brazilian government. The US media isn't saying that the US Department of Defense needs to send bombers over Brazil and nuke it. It's a shit regime in Brazil that they have, but it's not being talked about in the same terms as a country like Iran, and that's because Brazil isn't an obstacle to Western economic interests.
I think it's important because I think a lot of times more can be found in the criticisms of the likes of China in almost by looking inward rather than looking outward. So I've got a real problem with people that have just got a completely, not that, again, I'm with Morgan, that I've obviously got lots of criticisms of a country like China, but the fact that people would spend all their energy, for example, talking about hot topic, not the place to go into a discussion, but say like the Uyghur community in China, right? Okay, that's all well and good discussing that and being critical of that, but if you're not going to be critical about the way racism unfolds itself, particularly right now as we record in America, in particular, obviously Britain as well, Western societies, I think it's sometimes more a reflection on your own country, the way that people criticize the likes of China, and that they're just very, very, people are very, and the media are very quick to point the finger, but they find it very difficult to sometimes look at themselves, look at their own country and how that's organized and how that's run and how, I mean, we're not holier than thou, and we're definitely sinners ourselves. So this idea that we're good, and whatever China does is naturally bad because it's China. It's a difficult narrative to combat, but it's I think it says a lot more about the people who are saying it and where they're from, sort of thing.
Well, yeah, I was going to add that, look, China made a $2 billion donation to the WHO, and no one's talking about that. And when they are, it's like, oh, but they've still not done enough. China's doing this almost to make amends for all the mess it made, and that's just not the case.
This is what I mean when I say my criticism of China are conceptual. They're in terms of the structuring of government and things like that. They're in terms of like news stories or things that are supposed to be happening in China. That's where I'm more skeptical because I know where the sources are coming from. I was thinking it'd be interesting to talk a bit about race if we're talking about misinformation regarding China, because I think there's a lot of racism involved, and we know there is. There's Trump calling it the Chinese virus, a ton of people blaming China on ethnic grounds for the coronavirus, and even socialists, I think, do it as well, because I think there's a lot of socialists who are very willing to praise countries like Cuba and stuff for their response to coronavirus, but less willing to praise China. And I think a lot of the time, and I know there's a lot of solidarity between those countries, so they're not as different as some people might think. Like a lot of the time, that the criticisms are based on race, because like Cuba's seen as like, oh, this cool place, like socialism's cool over there, and like Eastern socialism, I think is critiqued on a different level. Maybe that's a race thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there certainly is a racial component to it, and I think it fundamentally comes down to a deep misunderstanding of how China works, because it's a massive country of 1.4 billion people, like we said. It's very complicated how it works, and there's a lot of nuances involved. I think people in the West, especially the Western left, have a very one-dimensional view of socialism, where they look at a country and say it is or is not socialist. They don't consider that there's room for nuance involved. So your average sort of white British socialist, in quotation marks, will look at Cuba and they'll say, yeah, Cuba's great. Then they'll look at China and say, oh, it's an authoritarian, tanky hellhole. The reality is that it's a lot more complex than that. And obviously China is not above criticism, but it's not as blanketly, it's not as clean as saying China is terrible. I think there's certainly elements of good and bad governance in China. And again, we'll save some of the spicier stuff, I suppose, for our China episode that's eventually going to happen, whether or not I want it to. But should we maybe move
might
on?
get some more of the hate comments on that one.
I mean, that is going to be our most hated episode, I guarantee it. But maybe we should move on to some other socialist countries and the way they've responded to the virus.
China's pattern of misconduct is well known. For decades, they've ripped off the United States like no one has ever done before. Hundreds of billions of dollars a year were lost.
Right, so we talked a little bit about how the response to coronavirus has been from socialist nations. So if we want to talk a bit now about sort of the grassroots socialist response to coronavirus.
I mean, in a UK aspect, it's been a mix really between the fact that, as we said before, due to the lack of the state to want to do anything to help people, lots of people are throwing themselves into charitable organisations. Has been one method. People volunteering at food banks, going around their local community and seeing what the needs are, and it's been the coronavirus response has almost been like the classic, what David Cameron talked about, the big society, that if you wither away the state and the state's responsibilities, the goodwill the good nature of people, they will try their best to step up to the plate to try and fill those gaps that have been empty, sort of like the state have taken away. I think we're seeing that with the coronavirus, and I'm not saying it's right; it's totally wrong. Like so many of these things, the state should be doing. The state should be ensuring that people are fed, watered, etc. But yeah, we're seeing that food banks are doing more and more. Citizens' Advice are doing. I mean, they've been busier than they've ever been since they started in the Second World War, giving people advice on anything from housing to benefits advice, etc. We've seen with like I'm in Worcestershire, and the county council have done you can sign up to help volunteer with the COVID response sort of thing. So it's all based on people having to give up their own time away from their already busy lives, especially if they're already working, to try and help combat this virus, rather than a big sort of centralized response. And sadly, because it's this sort of patchwork way of doing it, there's just not been a consistent response across the board, as much as people have worked so hard to try and do their best for people in their communities.
Well, yeah, I think it's really good for the people of Britain to come together every Thursday night and create kinetic energy through clapping that that powers hospitals. They're keeping ventilators and lights on in hospital wards through the sheer kinetic energy. No, but to be serious,
you fucking idiot.
to be serious though, no. I've seen a lot of it mostly in America. Community activist groups going forward. A lot of Antifa chapters. If the, I don't know if Antifa have chapters, but Antifa groups, shall we say, are coming together and creating parcels and distributing them for free. People don't even know about, you don't even have to ask them. They're just going around and distributing it for free, knocking on doors, bread, flour, like the essentials, basically. They're buying them out of their own money and stuff and basically distributing them.
Yeah, and it's great you mentioned that. I mentioned in the first half how on the community level, China has had a very similar response. The difference is that in China, all this stuff is done with the assistance of the state. The state is there helping people coordinate their efforts. It's helping them fund this thing. Because obviously, if you're buying people food and medical supplies, it's not free. Whereas here in the West, we've had nothing of the same sort. People who are doing this out of the good of their hearts to help their fellow community members, they're paying also out of their own wallet. And a lot of people, they don't have this money to pay for these things anymore, especially feeling the financial crunch caused in part by the virus. And I think also unions have done quite a lot of good work. It's worth shouting out to them. Not across the board necessarily. There have been some unions that have sort of said that we need to come together in national unity and support the government more or less. But if you look at GMB, for example, they propose requisitioning private hospitals to meet the capacity that's needed. But instead, the government, of course, is renting private hospitals at a cost of £2.4 million per day. So it just goes to show the sheer reluctance of capitalist states, or at least the UK and America, to actually involve themselves in the crisis and try to help people. They have like this pathological fear of state intervention. It's ridiculous.
I just wanted to touch a bit on what Dan said about David Cameron's Big Society, and I know what you mean. I think it's so his idea was like basically, and a lot of conservatives say it, don't they, that if people are left to their own devices, they'll look after each other in a charitable fashion anyway. The state doesn't need to get involved. The reason I disagree with it is because obviously, why not just have the state involved to help that feeling along or whatever. But it reminds me of a Tony Benn story. I don't know if you guys have heard it. He always used to tell it. They got Tony Benn, right? Talking about when he was on a train once, and he got on the train and it was silent, and he sat down, and someone across from him was like, I think this would have been probably during the Thatcher era. I don't know, maybe it was the 80s, the story that he was talking about. And someone was sitting there. So like the stock market had recently become a big thing where people would like to sit in reading the papers, looking at the stock market, and calling people. I don't know how that shit works, but yeah, doing that. Basically, there's businessmen, there's just people chatting amongst themselves, being very like private or whatever. And then he said the train broke down, and suddenly after like half an hour of this train breaking down, everyone was kind of communicating with each other. People were like handing out cups of tea. People were like, I don't know, talking about their lives, whatever, just communicating. So I think, and he says by the end it started as a Thatcherite train, and then in the end it was a socialist train. That's the story that he gives. So I think basically that it is true that people will tend to look after each other. We're not born with this innate selfishness and individualistic mentality that they try and tell us that we are. I think there is some truth to, like, it's a bad example because it's David Cameron who's talking about it, but I know what you mean. The point you're gathering from it is that people will look after each other, and like you said, it is happening in the UK because the government ain't doing it for us, so got to do it ourselves.
Well, I'd also add another hot take. Look at the VE Day celebrations. A lot of people came together for VE Day and gave away like cake and tea and biscuits and all sorts of stuff. Like communities really came together without crack
and they
heroin.
They gave Rona around a hell of a lot as well. I mean, that fucking conga, Jesus Christ. That was, because if you do put a rope between you that's 2 meters long, if you move forwards, the corona just runs away. That's a fact. That's a card hold fact.
Oh yeah, of course.
But yeah, it's almost a shame that, not a shame, it's wonderful that communities can come together and people have got caring natures, particularly people, it's not just left-wing people, it's lots of different people that obviously care about community, but left-wing people who want to dive dive in front of the community, like the communities they really want to care for, working class communities and people down on the low. They want to dive in front of them and help them. And the best way to do that right now is through organisations like food banks, etc. But that does cause the Conservatives, for example, to start saying things like they like the fact that food banks are a thing because it shows the community cares. And then all of a sudden that starts to become the norm. Food banks become part of society, e.g. like food stamps are in America. That just becomes part and parcel of British society, that a certain section of the population have to get their food from a food bank. And it's difficult because that caring nature, like, you know, I volunteered at food banks, that you want to help people, but it's not getting to the root of the problem. It's perhaps helping normalising it, and it's a very difficult balance to do, really.
Yeah, you know, you are seeing people really, really come together around key community points. I think Samaritans have been hot on it. A lot of mental health charities have been really all over this, making sure that, you know, in isolation, people aren't left behind in terms of people who have mental health issues who would have been seeing counsellors. Are a lot of people within the community are offering, you know, counselling sessions. Just, you know, your neighbour across the street or whatever in your area as well. So I think it's more than just supplies. It's a true community spirit.
Yeah, and when we're talking about food banks and sort of mutual aid groups, I think it's important that we don't depoliticize them, because they are fundamentally political. You know, the reason that these groups have to exist is because of political reasons, but people don't necessarily see it like that. They just see, you know, there are people who can't afford food for some reason. I guess I'll go help out. And it's great that these people are going to go and help out, you know, helping a lot of people, but it doesn't fundamentally address the causes of this, which are obviously capitalism, austerity, etc., etc. So if you join these groups, you have to try and it seems like your duty to try and spread some sort of political awareness of why over 1 million people in the UK rely so regularly on food banks. You know, it's not just because that's just the way it is. It's because of a deliberate program of austerity implemented by the Conservative Party. So it is fundamentally a political issue, and I think there's a big problem in the UK is that we seem to depoliticize everything. You know, I think the media plays a big role in this. Whenever there's a problem, it's immediately depoliticized as fast as it possibly can be, when fundamentally so many of our problems are deeply political.
So when you see Tory MPs having photo opportunities with Trussell Trust food banks, and it's like, how, as a volunteer at that food bank, are you allowing that photo opportunity with a Tory MP to happen? It's just, and the worst one from the 2019 general election, I think it was someone on Victoria, Derbyshire, where they said it was like what do they call them? Is it like Vox Pops, where they like talk to people on the street about, what do you think of this? And they said, I'm going to vote Conservative because I heard Jeremy Corbyn on TV say he's going to end food banks, and I need my food bank. And it's like, well, it's difficult because the first point of call has got to be to care for the people that need it. But like Harley says, there's got to be if you don't bring the politics into it constantly, almost, I mean, without shoving it down people's throats, then it so easily gets depoliticized that all of a sudden ending food banks is a bad thing because people rely on them so much, rather than, that's the negative vision, rather than the positive vision of, well, shouldn't everyone be able to access good, healthy, nutritional food, you know, 7 days a week?
I think like all of this touches on like the importance of community. I think one of the things I think it's one of the things that we can things that we can grab from the coronavirus situation. One of the positives that we can take from it is, if you can take any positives from it, is that we do need to start building community. And my mum always talks about the importance of community. I think that's one of the differences that Thatcher made, was that before Thatcher, at least, there was this sense of community. So if you wanted to build radical thinking, you could do it through the community, and that's just something that we haven't had since Thatcher at all. There's almost no sense of community, and there is an element of that, I suppose, coming back because of coronavirus, with all these different organizations that you're talking about. So yeah, people often criticize socialists about not having a sort of a vision of how they're going to achieve things and how they're going to achieve the society they want. I think that is one concrete example, is that you can, if we're gonna achieve socialism, we need popular support. And one of the ways to garner popular support is to go out there into the communities and spread the message and blah, blah, blah.
What you're talking about, Morgan, I think it's called atomization. It's basically the idea that, people used to have these really cohesive social groups. So you'd have, if you identify as working class, you'd have all these sort of working class venues that you'd visit on a regular basis, and you'd know the people there, and you'd know the people in your local community. And within, your groups, whether that be class or gender or racial or whatever, you knew the people in your groups. But capitalist society, especially, like you said, since Thatcher, has really sort of put things on a much more individualistic basis. And it's sort of, it's called atomization because it sort of breaks down society into the individual atoms. And, we need to come together and form something cohesive. But at the moment, we're just spread out little atoms with very little awareness of our local community. I mean, to be honest, I don't fucking know my neighbors, and I have not moved house in my entire life, and I do not know my neighbors. I know one of them, and I think that really demonstrates the point quite well, because 60 years ago, I would know all my neighbors, no doubt. But capitalist atomization's really sort of driven people into their own little bubble, where the only thing they care about is themselves and their immediate surroundings, rather than the community as a whole.
I suppose many of my viewers will think it's not a laughing matter.
Yes, well, I can't quite work out whether you're telling me that I've gone too slow or too fast.
So what other things can we take? What are the positives? Sounds morbid to say, but what are the positives do you think we can take from coronavirus?
So yeah, I think this crisis with sort of the coronavirus it's shown in different ways. It's affected different groups in different ways, in which a lot of crises that happen normally affect one group in particular, whereas coronavirus seems to be affecting more than one group. I think it's affected both working classes and middle classes in different ways. It's affecting working class people, in which the radical potential for us as the left is to start to create a world in which we are now, there hopefully is a greater understanding about who keeps our economy running, who are the important people as part of our economy. It is these key workers that for so long have been underpaid, considered low skilled. If they stopped going to work one day, Britain would fall apart. But if the insurance brokers and the bankers don't go to work, things sort of move on as normal. So that's the one side of
things get better.
Yeah, exactly. That's 10 times better. I think the other side of things is for people that are either who once saw themselves as being closer to middle class than they were working class, and saw themselves as being in secure employment, saw themselves as particularly self-employed people, saw themselves as like good sort of well-to-do, and potentially starting to maybe even consider vote Tory because they're maybe sort of making some sort of foundations in their life. This has completely thrown that concept out for them. And if they've had to apply for universal credit, they're now applying for a benefit system which is designed to break you, and is designed for only a small population of the vulnerable who are without a voice are meant to use. And now loads of people are using it. Lots of sort of self-employed people that, like I say, once saw themselves as very secure, have either been thrown into insecure work, or they've been made to go towards the British state benefit system, which is literally designed to break people. And then the other side of it are people that have been able to continue to work as normal from home. So like the middle classes with sort of office professional jobs that haven't been furloughed. The radical potential for them is that they understand now that where is the importance in life? Is the importance in work and making lots of money for a big business where all the money just shoots upwards from all your hard work? Or is it spending more time with your family? Is it more leisure time? So I think there's sort of three bits to it. There's the key workers are important. You're not as secure in life as you think you are. And also for people that are secure in life, they've got to spend time with their families. They're pursuing interests they've never even thought about pursuing. They're reading books they've always wanted to read. They're starting to reevaluate, hopefully, what that life is. And so I think there's almost radical potentials across the across the spectrum of socio-economic classes, obviously with the key workers being the most important people we need to organise to begin with. But I think there's lots of arguments that can be made as to why coronavirus has sort of exposed lots of things for lots of different people.
It's a bit ironic, isn't it? Because it's a shame that it took coronavirus or a situation that actually affects everyone equally for people to see the importance and the value of things like solidarity and some of these things that we bang on about. It's a shame that it took something like coronavirus to make them see that we do in fact live in a society. But on the other hand, it is positive because it's something that we can build on, like with what's happened with, I'm trying to think of the exact story, and the government has shifted, haven't they, on they were going to charge immigrants, is it like £600 a year or something to use the NHS, something like that, and now immigrant health workers are exempt from that. I think that's wrong, because I think we should value people. We shouldn't be charging any immigrants to use the NHS at all, and we shouldn't value people based on the type of work that they do. But at the very least, at least it's showing maybe that people understand that immigrants come here and contribute and do the same, are the same as us, kind of thing. At least maybe that people will realize things like that.
I'm going to be a bit of a dissenting voice here and say that I don't particularly think that there has been a large change in societal perceptions across, sort of class boundaries. If you look at the example that Morgan brought up, for example, it was the work of unions pressuring the government that got them to reverse on that policy. And I've not really seen any particular evidence of people who are in secure work turning around and saying, oh, you know what, I'm going to support these union workers because I really value what they do for society. If you think about the average kind of person, both here in the UK and in the US, who's sort of clamoring for the end of lockdown, it's a sort of person who's saying that everyone should go back to work. And it makes you question sort of what kind of value they put on the lives of these so-called unskilled workers who they're basically saying should expose themselves to the virus in order to get the economy running again. They're putting the economy, it's sort of abstract concept, they're just saying the economy over and over again. They're putting it above the lives of the people who actually make the economy work, which are the so-called unskilled workers. But I do absolutely agree with Dan in that I think the pandemic has really highlighted that the unskilled workers are the ones who keep society running. They've sort of been rebranded now as essential workers, but the fact is they were essential to begin with. You can't have a hospital, a modern hospital anyway, without cleaners. You can't have a supermarket without people to stock the shelves and run the tills. You can't have a functional capitalist economy without a mass working class who are actually doing all of the hard work. But for some reason, sort of capitalist mythology has convinced people that these people are failures of some kind. If you're 30 years old and working at Tesco, society sees you as a failure. But the reality is that, you're just a worker, you're doing your job, and your job is important. You're making profits for the capitalist class, which is not the most desirable way to do your work, but it is a job that is necessary for the functional society.
Yeah, so maybe it's better to say what is, hopefully that's what people reflect on it, then, rather than people are suddenly changing their values. You're right, that was kind of over exaggerating it from me. Maybe it's, I was
going to say that's the same with me.
I hope that that's the way people are viewing it or begin to do it. It's hard to get in people's minds this early.
I wasn't saying that people who are insecure work, who are like realizing the value of their leisure time versus work time, automatically are now, flying the red flag. I'm saying that there's a potential there for people to reach out to people across the spectrum. Obviously,
yeah, it was me who gave more of a poor example. I think it's more of me inferring. I hope that's what people are viewing it as.
With the key workers being the most important, because we've said that the workers create the wealth, etc. But I'm just what I'm trying to say is that there are potentials to start making arguments with people from across society who, you know, I've seen lots of people that I know that are insecure, quite secure, you know, well-paying jobs, like sort of people probably older, sort of family friends and stuff. They've just said, like, putting on social media all the time about how much they love in spending time with their family and doing all these different things. I mean, they're almost, in a sense, they're almost, maybe not, they're not sort of benefiting from a suspension of capitalism, but like this sort of molded version of capitalism where they're being taken out the rat race a little bit, and they're being, obviously they'll potentially working from home, but their work-life balance is a lot more set towards their own interests rather than the interests of their bosses, perhaps. And I just thought that there's a potential there, as well as organising around, you know, what is key work and why are these people key workers, that there's a potential there to stop pointing more people in the direction of, okay, the reason that you have enjoyed, you perhaps, if you haven't been economically affected by lockdown, the reason you might have actually enjoyed it, but obviously the horrific pandemics going on, is because you have almost, you've benefited from suspension of capitalism in that you've had more time at home, you're not on the commute, you're spending more time with family and pursuing interests. You might have, I know, you started writing that book you've always talked about, and or learn the guitar or whatever. That's the reason you're enjoying it, is because, you know, because you're sort of out of the rat race a little bit by spending all this time at home.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And, you know, if that's sort of the potential reaction of people who are in secure work, it'd probably be a good idea to look at people who aren't necessarily in secure work. So, you know, like I mentioned, people working in shops, for example, there's definitely been a notable, or at least insofar as we can measure it, there's been a notable increase in what we'd call class consciousness, people realizing that it is these supposedly unskilled laborers that are the foundation of the economy, and that collectively they do have the power to do things. Union membership has increased by 100,000, is it? Somewhere in that region. Either way, that's a fucking massive increase in such a short period of time, and all it does really is point towards the fact that at least some people, you know, 100,000 clearly, have decided that a union is able to better represent their interests and actually stick up for them.
There is power.
I think the union point's it's really interesting. I think it's 91,000 in the last year is the increase, and there's been a big increase in younger people more likely to be in precarious, insecure work, sort of in the large part. It's a difficult one. That joining trade unions are a good thing. I have a difficulty with just telling people to join a trade union, because I just don't think that's enough. Joining trade union is good in that if you are worried about your rights at work, you have access to, on your own, you know, you have access to a brilliant legal services within unions. You can access a whole range of benefits. But if you do not become a trade union activist and take active steps within your union to sort of take all of the on like the courses you can and stuff about being a workplace rep, you start bringing more people in your workplace to the union, and then you start demanding things of your bosses and the company you work for, then joining a union, it's good, but it's not enough. I mean, union membership going up on its own isn't the be all and end all. I mean, some unions are absolutely hemorrhaging members that are just paying subs and just doing nothing, like nothing's happening with it. They're not feeling empowered to be a union activist. And I think that's an important thing that we need to start doing if we're talking about organising as a left, is that we don't need people to just join a union. We need people to be active within their union branches, signing people up in their workplaces, democratizing unions where they can, because obviously, you know, union bureaucracy is something that a lot of people can have difficulties with.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. You know, it's very important that people do join unions, but fundamentally, a union is usually on the defensive, so to speak. So typically, when someone's unfairly dismissed, that's when the union jumps in. And obviously, there are cases where the union actually goes out of its way to make demands of the boss. But on the whole, you know, unions, there are obviously radical unions like the Industrial Works of the World, the Wobblies. You know, there are unions that do have as their stated aim the destruction of the capitalist system. But for the most part, the majority of unions, especially in the UK, you'd really struggle to find many big unions in the UK who actively call for the end of capitalism. Most unions, they do exist to represent workers within the capitalist system. So it really highlights the importance of having to work outside of unions as well, whether that be in mutual aid community groups or political parties, whatever it is. You have to organize more broadly than just solely through a union. But a union is a great starting point. And if you're a worker trying to defend your pay from the boss who wants to slash your pay, obviously the union's the go-to point.
I think it's an important thing to sort of with Corbynism as well, in terms of unions, in which, 91,000 on the face of it is good, but in the grand scheme of changing society, 91,000 people joining a trade union, if you can get a few hundred really, really core, strong activists spread around the country, that's a good thing. But sort of since Corbynism, has the trade union movement really moved that far? Like, have we lost the amount of days that we lose for strike days in Britain is still way, way low. I know strike laws are very, very difficult, but I think there's still a feeling amongst trade unions, certain trade unions, not all. I mean, some are brilliant. Like Unite in certain ways are brilliant. RMT are brilliant, but there's still a certain thinking that get a Labour government in, repeal the trade union laws, and then we'll be active. But that just doesn't have to be the case. I mean, you've got things like the Deliveroo strikes and stuff like that, and the McDonald's strikes, things that are, I don't know, I think there's just too much of a bias sometimes of just get a Labour government in and then we can do good things. But really, since the Corbyn project kicked off, we haven't sold the argument of trade unionism enough to people. And that's something that if people are starting to join now and they're starting to understand they need support at work, it's important to turn them into proper trade unionists, not just trade union members.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that obviously I think a lot of that relationship, a lot of the problem that you've described, it comes down to the fact that unions have such an integrated relationship with the Labour Party. And the Labour Party, the Parliamentary Labour Party, they're not calling for the destruction of capitalism. They're just calling for, at best, a better social welfare state. And it's sort of a reciprocal relationship in that this is what Labour is advocating. So it's also becomes sort of the policy of these larger trade unions who are so closely associated with Labour. And then obviously if Labour is thinking that that's what the union wants, then that's what Labour is going to reflect in its policy. So it's sort of cyclical in that nature, that they both adopt this reformist position where they think that just making mild changes to the capitalist system will fix everything. And it just goes back and forth until you're stuck in the position that we're in now, where the majority of unions in the UK aren't offering any sort of radical alternative. They're offering better working conditions under capitalism, which is good. It's better than having a shit working conditions under capitalism, but it's not the solution. It doesn't fundamentally change anything.
Yeah, like you say, it's definitely a cycle. In Thatcher's day, it was the unions have too much power, let's reduce the power. Now it's the unions have not enough power, let's increase the power. And it is just going to go back and forth. But it shifts the debate from let's abolish capitalism, let's actually do good for workers, to let's ask for minor improvements within this system that is based on exploitation and unfairness. And I think that's the fundamental point. Unions, like you say, are not the be all and end all. They're a start, perhaps, but they're definitely not a means to an end or an end in itself.
So maybe we talked about the coronavirus. Hopefully there's some rebalancings that we can force, a rebalancing towards who are the important workers in society. What are going to be the tools in which we encourage people to sort of demand more? Our trade unions, one, for example. I think another important thing is, in terms of the response, is going to be the economic response as a result of things like the furlough scheme, what the government are going to decide to do. I mean, the talk has already been a pretty bleak economic outlook about recession and things like that. I just sort of wondered what people thought about. Is it going to be easy enough? So for example, the financial crash happens in 2008, and then austerity happens. And what David Cameron and the Conservatives did so well was depoliticise their response. So when they were cutting things, they kept saying things like, we're all in this together. If you, if we take our medicine now, it's because of like the deficit, we'll take the medicine and we'll feel better and we'll get through it, etc. And it was depoliticizing their response, where what they were actually doing was carving away the state even more, getting rid of the last sort of, the last bits of social democracy that was left in Britain. And they depoliticized their response basically. And the Tories have got the perfect storm here to basically wither away the state even more from British society, because they can sell it as, well, we had to do this. It's not our fault. It's the pandemic's fault. So I sort of wonder what people thought. What do we do to fight against that? This idea that they're going to start cutting more services. I mean, they're already talking about pay freezes for these key workers.
That they want, too, isn't it?
Yeah, the key workers they want us to clap for on a Thursday. They're always talking about pay freezes, but their argument is going to be, oh, well, we had to do it, which it's just, I mean, yeah, furloughs. I think furlough costs. Sorry, guys. Furlough costs. I don't have that. Scrap that. Continue.
But they're in the position
several tens of billion or something. Isn't it?
Not only are they increasing austerity again, they're also raising taxes as well
on the wrong people.
Yeah. So it's not the super rich that are going to get that. It's the lower and the middle classes.
So you look now, furloughs costing the government £14 billion per month, which on the face of it, that sounds very bad. But so by the time it finishes in October, it will cost about £70 billion. We spent £500 billion bailing out the banks in 2009. Trident cost £200 billion. HS2 so far has cost £106 billion, and we lose £70 billion.
Avoidance.
We lose £70 billion in tax avoidance a year. So what they're going to do is, they're going to use £70 billion of a furlough scheme and a job retention scheme to completely wither down the state, when realistically it makes no.
I don't think people.
Whatsoever.
I think it will be easier to convince people of the opposing message there as well. I think because we've heard it all before, like in 2010 onwards, and two, because like we've talked about earlier, the sense of community, or the idea that the coronavirus affects everyone in some capacity. I think I don't think people will. Well, I hope at least people won't lie down so easily for some of these. If they do try and cut their way out of the whatever economic mess we're in after coronavirus.
So obviously we've just printed a pretty bleak picture of where the British economy is going, and by all predictions, we're fucked, guys. We're in a bad shape after this pandemic, and I think that's probably why the government is so eager to ease the lockdown, is because they realise that, yikes, this is getting expensive, guys. But so I suppose on a practical sort of level, how exactly do you challenge the inevitable cuts that are going to come up? And I know that we've just said a fair bit about how unions aren't great, but join a union. If you're in work and you're not in a union, you absolutely should join a union. There's plenty to choose from. Already mentioned the IWW, the Wobblies. There's going to be an industry-specific union, whichever union you're in. Join it, because you're probably going to need it in the coming months and years. And it is a great place to meet people who are in your sector of industry who might be open to hearing more radical ideas, because obviously it takes a certain level of understanding of the way that politics and economics works to sort of decide that joining a union is something that's good for you. You don't join a union just because you feel like it. You obviously understand there's a purpose to joining a union. So anyone who's in a union has a basic understanding of the way that capitalism is going to try and fuck them. And it's really a great place to try and push for more radical alternatives. But the point is that you have to try and organize outside of unions as well, because the unions themselves, especially in ones that don't have particularly democratic structures, they're a lot more resistant to change, and they're a lot less likely to actually endorse a radical solution to the economic crisis.
I'd say as well, we're talking about wider things. Find whatever renters union may be local to you. Acorn is one, which is sort of started out as a renters union. It's turned into more of just a generally working class union, helping people with their general issues. But there's lots of renters unions out there that help you with like issues with landlords and things like that. But again, that's building on, that's not just being part of, it's not being one person on their own and you're just part of this bigger thing. It's about getting involved in that bigger thing, getting your street involved in that big thing to fight back against inevitably what's going to come. It's going to be, as James said, it's austerity 2.0, and it's going to be Boris Johnson at the helm, and I do think he's going to convince a lot of people that this is a necessary thing that has to happen as a response to something that we couldn't have predicted, this coronavirus. And we need to join organisations and be part of organisations that are just going to fight every fibre of their being against that narrative. Because I think for too many years we lost that after the financial crash. Labour obviously wasn't radical enough. Maybe the unions weren't radical enough either in just combating this idea that it's necessary. There is the Thatcher. There is no alternative. There is no alternative other than to cut because we had this horrific pandemic. And we need to fight against that because we've said, listen to our last podcast, the money's out there. We've just got to, there's a will to gain and all that.
I think this is one of the key differences of having a Corbyn-led Labour Party and having a Starmer-led Labour Party is that talk of narrative and having an anti-narrative. So having a leader of the opposition or a leadership of the opposition who would be actively opposed to whatever poor response Johnson. We're getting ahead of ourselves a bit. Maybe Starmer will maybe if Boris Johnson decides that we need to cut industry, cut everything to recover from coronavirus, maybe Starmer will rise up and be like, no, I'm not having it. I'm not having it there.
He'll have 5% fewer cuts than Boris is offering.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not going to happen. But that's one of the key things. That's one of the key differences now having a Starmer-led Labour Party is that we're not going to have that, and we're not going to have that sort of our narrative, our counter-narrative being put in the public eye as much as it would have. So that's a shame. So that's why we got to build left media sources. Like, for example, I just got my copy of Tribune in the mail. I'm excited to read that. So yeah,
I think an important thing would be if you're not sure what to do because of if you're not sure what to do because you joined Labour Party and then you're hearing lots of people saying that it's not the be all and end all, etc., and you're worried about what's next and how to organise next. Start reading about the groups that organised around the world as a result of the 2008 crisis. And I'm not saying that they were successful in everything they did, or they weren't successful at all, but start seeing why, it's important for the left to read its history and build upon it. Read about the Occupy movement. Read why, for a lot of people, it was a really radicalised, it was a massive moment of radicalisation for so many people, but the Occupy movement had a sell-by date and it didn't go as far as it could have done. For example, the protests in city squares across Europe, what did they turn into? They turned into political parties like Podemos and Syriza. Where did they go? Start reading about because that's what's coming again. We're going to have another financial crash in which the governments and the powers that be are going to make us pay for it when we didn't fucking cause it. So learn about what fellow activists did last time out, take the positives and learn from their mistakes, and hopefully we can build. I nearly said the words resistance, but that sounds like I'm fucking lib #resistance. But build genuinely a working class resistance against what's going to come, because the pricks are in charge and they're gonna make us pay for it. So we need to start. It's hard because obviously organising when you can't literally physically organise people because there's a deadly pandemic going on is difficult. But I don't think you can tell people anything more than be prepared and start joining organisations and doing online lectures and online courses with people like Acorn and your trade unions and stuff like that. So the minute we're let back out the gate, almost we can not just help out with the local food bank, but we can actually empower communities to fight back.
Solidarity forever. Solidarity desperation through the workers' blood shall run. There can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. Yet what force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one? But the union makes us strong.